Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm going to talk very briefly about the top-level issues associated with sanctions risk, and then Andrew's going to go into some of the detail. I hope in questions we can deal with some of those things that are giving you a problem at the moment. So let's have a look at what the problem is with sanction risk. Well, you're directly exposed to risk, of course, if you engage in any commercial or financial transaction with a sanctioned entity, whether that's an individual, a corporation, or indeed a country. But you should be aware that there's a wide range of indirect risks that come both with misinterpreting the legal provision, but also in view of the partners and people you trade with as well. What complicates the issue immensely is that we have overlapping sanctions regimes relating to different countries, different sectors, and different types of individuals. And where they overlap, you get a confusion of what's supposed to be in place legally, and even some countries don't understand that, and some governments. So obviously it's quite difficult for any sort of corporation or financial institution. And also we have a situation where, because sanctions occur on the international markets mostly, they are partial in their application within those markets. So some systems, some transactions will be sanctioned, others won't be. And depending on where you base your operations, whether in your home country or abroad, means that you're exposed to different types of risk. There's also obviously a trading risk in dealing with countries who are sanctioned, because you're not actually covered by any legal liability either in the country that you're dealing with or indeed the people who are insuring you. So the risk you take in terms of trading, losing your investment or indeed your goods and services is very high indeed. Now, from the point of view of governments, sanctions busting is normally associated with other forms of crime. And we'll talk a little about that later, but most significantly, of course, it's related to money laundering, in some cases terrorism, but in all cases criminality and trafficking. And all that represents quite a substantial reputational risk, as you've seen with the Panama Papers, for any firm that is either at the centre or indeed on the periphery of any sort of sanctions regime that is being evaded. And of course, it's not just a question of legality. Sometimes that reputational risk can stain you and your company because it's considered to be illegitimate. So trading with a regime that perhaps isn't legally sanctioned, it may well be in the eyes of the world that the regime is doing something that is illegitimate or illicit, and therefore your own company will catch some of the blame for that as well. And finally, I think, forgive me if you're in the United States, I think we have to recognize that particularly in the United States law enforcement agencies are particularly aggressive in relation to sanctions busting, and they know where the loopholes are, and if you're caught in one of those loopholes, then you're going to have to pay them an awful lot of money in terms of fines, as you know. So what are sanctions? Really, they're political instruments that countries and international organizations use to achieve certain ends. They want to alter or stabilize the attitudes of certain regimes or countries. But the interesting thing is, instead of using military or other methods, they use financial and commercial means. And I'm afraid it's the mismatch between political ends and financial and commercial ways and means that introduces distortions into the regime, and also the means of evading it and getting caught evading it as well. They're rarely comprehensive, which means that not all countries sign up to them. The number of people that actually are sanctioned in any particular case is not always readily identifiable. For example, with regard to Iran, one likes to think that it's the regime and its adherents that are sanctioned, but actually most of the sanctions used to fall on the people themselves, because the bulk of the wealth of the regime and its elites was held offshore. And that's why I say normally the target regime is less affected than the population. But in almost every case, we find that when there's a sanctions regime in place, there is a thriving and very energetic black economy. when sanctions were imposed on Iraq, for example, before the most recent Gulf War, 19 years of sanctions produced effectively what was a fully black economy. There was barely a functioning structural economy, and we saw the results of that in the so-called insurgency and the other actions afterwards. And the fact of life is that sanctions regimes are normally a holding action. It's really a means of restraining or constraining a regime rather than actually bringing it to heel finally. And where are the loopholes? Well, partial regimes don't work because, for example, the United States or Europe imposes sanctions on a country or an entity, and there will be other people that will actually do business with them as well, who are not themselves subject to sanctions. During the Iran sanctions, we saw a lot of barter going on. So India, for example, would barter oil and gas with goods that India gave them. So you couldn't actually trail the money or any of the assets that were going back into Iran. There was also a huge amount of trafficking going on, mostly in goods that, again, couldn't be labelled or tracked, and very difficult indeed to follow the money in those situations because most of it was based on a cash economy. I think from the institutional point of view, what's really quite dangerous with these loopholes is that in many cases you see opaque beneficiary and ownership chains where the ultimate beneficial owner, whether perfectly legal or in fact illicit, actually can't be identified. And what's complicating that even further nowadays is you see a number of front companies, what is known as window dressing for those of you who are specialists, false accounting and shadow documentation produced in support of what looked like legitimate trading arrangements. And that's the extent is you can actually get software today that will actually falsify the accounts for you and update those falsifications as you put in the true accounts. And they can be presented online or indeed in book form anytime you like. Now, the other area where one has to look out is the extent to which sanctions regimes can be circumvented by dual-use goods, things that can be used in normal life, but also can be used in sanctioned sectors. So quite a lot of the stuff that you can buy on the high street could, as a dual-use good, be used in a sanctioned sector, like the oil and gas sector in Russia, for example. And everything in that area holds you liable for sanctions busting legislation if you're caught giving advantage or material aid, that's how the UK legislation puts it, to a sanctioned sector. So dual use goods are a real vulnerable area that we have to look at. So who's doing this? Well, quite a lot of people actually. The state in some cases is involved in systemic sanctions busting, state-based companies, and we know that in authoritarian states state-based companies have an overlap with the state, but they also get involved in these things. A whole host of intermediate facilitators and financial institutions who, in terms of window dressing, are legitimate, but in fact actually are conducting some of these trades themselves. But the real problem, and OFAC and quite a lot of other regulators are interested in this, is they have connections to other forms of financial crime, as we said, counterfeiting, money laundering, and terrorist financing. And in many ways, many of the indicators that we get for sanctions evasion come from this connection with these other forms of financial crime. And most of those are traffickers. They're obviously the people most involved. Those of you who know the Middle East will know there's a whole host of boats that go across the Straits of Hormuz from Oman, from the Musandam Peninsula to Iran, even today. But at the height of the sanctions regime against Iran, every night you would see hundreds of those boats going across back and forth, smuggling into Iran. And that continues in most sanctions regimes today. Informal networks and money transfers, this vast opaque structure centered on remittances, hawalas, and other forms of credit that aren't actually noted down in the conventional way. They can't be audited, they can barely be tracked. Another source, of course, is shadow banking, which we have to really keep tabs on if we want to identify where sanctions risk is lurking. Most important thing is to maintain good up-to-date databases and watch lists, of course, when it's related to other forms of crime. but added to that, you need good interpretive analysis by experts who know what to look for. Now, the whole issue of insiders and whistleblowers is important for two reasons. One is your insiders and whistleblowers may actually be the perpetrators, and a certain amount of incentivization has been given to this, of course, by United States legislation, where you actually get rewarded for whistleblowing. And I've seen a number of cases in Europe recently where the whistleblower has started the fire in order to be able to be seen to put it out and be rewarded as well. So you not only have to look out for active insiders who are actually working a sanctions busting routine, but also whistleblowers, I'm afraid, who are looking to take advantage of legislation and be rewarded. And those of you who are in compliance need to watch out for the fact that your own company, of course, may be involved in sanctions busting because of their own deliberate policy agreed at board level. And I've heard recently a company say, well, if we didn't do it, our competitors would. So it's a difficult call, both moral and practical, to say, I think something's going on in my company that needs to be highlighted. I think the biggest problem that I've seen, and most of the business that I deal with, is the issue of third parties and proxies. Many people nowadays, as you'll have seen from the Panama Papers and other revelations, the biggest problem is the identification of these third parties, because what we've seen is a host of states, particularly the ones that are a bit shakier, and shell companies and shell banks being set up to actually look like they're legitimate businesses, but in fact are conducting illegal activity. And those of you who've had a chance to dip into the Panama Papers will know that mostly people go for legal entities that are either wittingly or deliberately, unwittingly involved in these activities. In fact, they're perfectly legal firms. In some cases, they don't even know they're being involved, they're being used. And those legitimate entities are some of your partners. And so due diligence on those people you have close to you is almost as important as due diligence on people that you don't know very well. Because most illicit activity and those associated with regime evasion, sanctions evasion, are involved in long-term relationships. You will not see them pop up in episodic style, which is how we normally interpret these things. It'll be long-term agency and relationships, and they're difficult to track down. And my advice on this is not only watch out for your partners, but you also have to look at their partners as well. You're known by the company you keep, and certainly in financial crime, a good look at the people on the periphery of your partner's relationships is worth its weight in gold, because that's where you normally catch them. Let's have a look at Russia. Right now, the Western world has sanctioned Russia because of its invasion of eastern Ukraine and also its seizure of Crimea. And it's a complex set of sanctions based primarily on persons, and there's some of them you can see in the top left-hand corner, and sectoral as well, predominantly the oil and gas sector. And it's designed to restrict the flow of money that the oligarchs can get their hands on, but also put further pressure on the oil and gas sector, which of course is already constrained because of low oil prices. Now, part of the problem in Russia is that any action taken against the sanctions regime is predominantly based in state-based financial institutions, so they're both victims of sanctions but also perpetrators of those actions that are designed to evade them, but also the heavy involvement of state security and governmental institutions. So the full weight, for example, of governmental cyber capability, and that includes the telecommunications facilities in Russia, can be brought to bear in order to sustain some of this illicit activity. And of course, quite a lot of financial transactions are conducted through Russians who live abroad, who still retain links to their home country in terms of investment and of course of emotional commitment as well. Iran, sanctions are being relaxed at the moment, but it's quite confusing. If you live in Europe, you're subject to different legal constraints than you are in the United States. If you're a United States company, for example, that has a subsidiary in Europe, you also have a problem because that is indirect investment in Iran. And this whole series of legislation is something that even lawyers are having difficulty with. The most important thing to remember in Iran is that the power does not lie with the religious authorities. It's in the hands of the Republican Guard, the security forces and the armed forces, and the bulk of their assets are held offshore. In particular, you need to be very wary of Iran's relationship with China. It's been very close for the last 30 years at personal and governmental level, and many financial transactions in the retail and the financial sectors go through China. And so you may be dealing with a Chinese company, but in fact behind it you may be dealing with an Iranian one. There are a lot of informal links which can be exposed by looking at the way people interact at the personal level, but they're always opaque and very difficult. Now, where we're vulnerable here, of course, is that the United States is taking a really good look at these relationships at the moment, and it's important not to be caught holding the baby when the music stops. So have a look at the balance of offshore and onshore risk, because some of the entities in which Iran is still invested are subject to sanctions still. There are links to terrorism, and as with Russia, you have a diaspora risk as well. So how do we help ourselves in relation to all these various risks? Well, what I like to say is that you need to adopt a comprehensive approach. It's not good enough just to dip in and say, I'll do this, I'll do that, just to fulfill some sort of regulatory requirement. You have to think of it in terms of every aspect to which you're exposed. And it has to be a continuous process. You can't just pick it up at the end of the week and say, well, I'll do this before I go on weekend. You have to think about it all the time. You are always exposed if you're invested in and around sanctioned countries or institutions. You have to understand the context, and that means you have to read up, you have to provide yourself with intelligence, and also interpret, or get somebody to interpret what the purpose of the sanctions is and how a country see themselves enforcing it. You have to reduce the large number of false positives that you get, and you have to look for optimum data points where you can actually hub all the information that you can get hold of in relation to your decisions. Now, Andrew's going to go into the detail of that a bit later, but I'll give you one tip. If you look at the detail that is on the SWIFT system, you can actually tease out quite a lot of false positives if you actually do some good analysis on that and cross-check your entities and see where the spelling errors are and where the other linkages are. But the most important thing is, and most companies can't do this with their own resources, they need to give it to somebody else, is you need to do very complex network analysis of not just the companies but the individuals involved in the transactions. And if you look at the illustration which I've provided, in order to get a conviction in the Enrollment case, which you'll remember from a few years ago, they had to produce this linkage of emails sent between all these people in order to secure a conviction, because if you left any part of that out, it would make a breach in the case. And that shows you the complexity that we're involved in. We're looking at it visually, but of course that would be done on a computer, and increasingly with better power and better memory, we can do that really quickly indeed. But not many companies, of course, can invest in that level of sophistication. Also, you've got to have data sets, and one of the companies I represent, Thomson Reuters, and others, of course, produce very updated data sets that are updated continuously, and that screens you for immediate risk. But the important thing is, again, don't look at individual episodes. It has to be end-to-end screening of these networks and supply chains to make sure that the risk isn't introduced in a place where you're not actually looking. Enhanced due diligence right now does not cover this, I don't think. Many regimes that I've seen actually do not have adequate coverage of end-to-end screening of networks and supply chains. So tip again, please check that it includes it. And do consider outsourcing your screening. You can outsource both the liability but also the activities associated with screening. The people that are specialists in this don't have to be distracted or indeed conflicted by your own business objectives, so they're actually quite good at it. But of course, make sure you tie them in as partners. If it goes wrong, they're partly to blame as well. And have a look around at companies that either that are thinking of investing in the countries that you're proposing to do business with, or indeed some of the institutions that are also in the periphery of those countries. So see how you can cooperate and collaborate, share each other's intelligence, and see how you can spread the risk rather than actually take it on your own. I think a relationship with OFAC, regulators and enforcers, is really important, and that needs again to be a continuous relationship so you can understand on a daily basis almost what it is they're looking for, how they're interpreting the law, and where they're targeting a lot of their intelligence. I think the most important thing, I think something that Andrew's going to repeat, is that actually it's everybody's business. It's not just compliance professionals, it's not just CIOs. Your board downward has to be involved in this and needs to know your vulnerability. And talking about that, one thing that I'm pushing very hard at the moment is everybody thinks because they have a risk-based formula, then that's going to be okay. I would say to you, that's not okay. I think you have to have a vulnerability-based approach, and you've got to ask yourself continuously what could happen and what would happen. And recently I said in a conference in New York, if you go down a risk-based approach, you get into a tick box culture. You think if you tick all the boxes, you're clear. No, you're not. There will be other vulnerabilities that you will have missed. So threats to the effectiveness of future regimes. I think you've seen from what I've said already that partial regimes, I'm afraid, are like a leaking sieve. Failing and flailing states that can't maintain their institutions or even international standards are a huge problem. And we've seen a large number of states, don't have to name them, around the world who can't even maintain their diplomatic integrity, let alone their financial institutions' integrity. So any organization dealing with those sorts of countries, of course, is immediately vulnerable. There's significant legal and regulatory complexity. I think we all know that. And I'm finding, even in dealing with lawyers now, they're finding it very difficult to actually give me a good vulnerability or risk call in relation to some of the legislation. And adding to that complexity is the role of synthetic currencies and blockchain technologies. We haven't got time to go into that, but I think you all appreciate that these out-of-sight currencies and also distributed ledgers have significant implications for both auditors and also regulators. It's going to be very difficult to actually, I'm just going to go back, to actually see where some of this money is going. One of the things that I think we need to keep an eye out for in future is that Russia and China and possibly Iran are going to set up an alternative SWIFT system. They've realized that if that they remain signed up to the current SWIFT system, obviously a dollar-based system, they are vulnerable to sanctions. So if they have geopolitical ambitions and the West seeks to sanction them, they suffer, and Russia is seeing that right now. If they have their own system, of course, they reduce their vulnerability to any form of sanctions. There is another issue, which I'm sure many of you have picked up already, is if there's an alternative SWIFT-based system, a lot of illicit and dirty money is going to fly into the alternative system and come back looking clean. And I think that presents a significant threat to anybody seeking to be compliant in international transactions in future. And any company that's dealing internationally in future needs to have a strategy in place pretty soon ahead of that system coming in, probably within 3 to 5 years. Because the minute it arrives, you're going to be subject to all sorts of constraints in how you do business. We mentioned already that there are shadow financial processes. Again, the answer to this is to follow the money to a point where it disappears, but then you have to follow the individuals or the institutions that are actually trading because the money becomes totally opaque and you can't actually see where it's going. And you do have to look beyond your third parties because it's their relationships that could get you into trouble. Innovation that's going to help in future. Well, big data, of course. We're seeing now vast capacity in terms of databases, storage and memory, but also interpretive tools now that are able to comb through that data and get the sort of information that you need. And I've seen some very complex algorithms that are able to nail both people and transactions very quickly indeed. Most importantly, it does multi-sector analysis rather than dealing with the very narrow channels and silos that we've seen in the past. And some of that interpretation relies on biorecognition. So instead of actually having a name, just a name, you actually end up with a biorecognition material as well. So it enables you to match the person to his or her biocharacteristics. We're seeing the regulators now and also lawyers using algorithms and artificial intelligence to actually interpret the legislation. So this is not good news for lawyers, I'm afraid, because what we're seeing is that we've got artificial intelligence and algorithms able to interpret masses of legal data and come up with a good and very accurate brief in terms of what you should be doing. Obviously there are liability issues there. You have to take a risk on the judgment of the computer. My advice is always have a human in the loop, so there'll be jobs for some lawyers in future, but not all of them. And of course this will be advanced in future by these new technologies associated with machine learning, where the computer actually just builds up expertise, it builds up interpretive information, and also the distributed ledgers associated with blockchain, because it will become increasingly difficult to hide transactions and assets in a blockchain regime. And something that I've seen recommended recently is that firms get a regulatory kite mark from their relevant regulator or authority to say they can be trusted, A, because they fulfill certain requirements, and B, because the nature of their transactions is fundamentally trustworthy. So those kite marks actually might be a way of actually giving you some sort of assurance. Okay, everybody, I'm going to hand over to that international man of mystery, Andrew Simpson, now, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you, Chris. So what I'm going to be doing is adding to, or try to add to some of the things that Chris covered, talking more about the practicality of using technology to achieve some of the things that Chris went through. I'm going to be talking about the automation options that you have around sanction screening. And then I'm going to go into some use case scenarios in terms of what type of screening should be done for different scenarios and different industries. I'm not just going to cover banking, but I'm also going to talk about MSPs, FinTech, gaming, and you saw where Chris talked about the end-to-end supplier chain vulnerability monitoring. Then that's another thing, and then how you can use technology to kind of enroll and engage the entire business in this culture of compliance. So those are the things I'm going to go through. Let's start with some of the automation options. So some of you may be using technology to do basic screening. So it could be that you're just doing ad hoc searches. So you're going in and putting in information and trying to find out if this person is on any sort of a sanctions list. You know, Chris talked about looking at the lists that are provided by Thomson Reuters, and then there are other lists that are provided for Dow Jones and so on. So whatever you do, some companies actually use more than one, so that's something that you might want to take a look at as well. There's also internal lists, or you might get some lists from your regulators as well, so that might be something to look at. But it's really kind of being able to put in relevant information. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing some screens. Some of these screens are from our own technology, but it's really intended to illustrate and allow you to understand the concepts a lot easier. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. So here, if you're searching for, say, Alan Stanford, and you're able to put in all the relevant information, whatever technology you're using should be able to take all of these inputs and search against whatever sanctions list you're using. Some sanctions lists contains millions of entries, and so the technology and the algorithms that you're using has to be very, very fast. So if you're looking for someone, it can't be taking 10 seconds or 20 seconds to come back. It has to be immediate. And so when you get a hit, then what do you do? In terms of automation options, it should allow you to kind of look at it, start your investigations, looking at who the person. So here it says Robert Allen Stanford. This is who you search for. We're getting a hit. It comes back with a match score. So it's not that you have to be searching and finding the exact things. You could be, you could be finding partial hits, or it could be that if you use, say, not just the name but the country and the date of birth, then you would get a much better or a higher risk score. But the information coming back from whatever data file that you're using should come back and tell you information about that person. The aliases, the different locations, what sanctions list the persons appear on, what countries do they belong in, and so on. Importantly, it also goes in and it tells you who they're linked to. And that's important because it starts to show you not just who you're doing business with, but who they are doing business with and who they are linked to, and whether or not those persons are on any sort of a sanctions list as well. These technologies normally allow you to process the alert, and so it would keep a track of everybody that touches it, what they say, what comments they're using, and so on. And that's important because it allows you to prove and to demonstrate that you're doing the right things, and that's very important for the regulators. Apart from just going in one-off and searching for someone, I think that you should be doing periodic or continuous screening because vulnerabilities change or your exposure changes because the environment changes. So for example, you could have a customer that's not on a sanctions list today, but then 3 weeks later they turn up on a sanctions list. Or it could be that there's something that in your customer data that you had before that weren't allowing you to get a hit, and when you update the customer information, now you're getting a hit. So it changes on either side, and so that's why you need to be doing that periodically. Customers normally ask us, do we need to be doing this every day? I don't think so. I think it depends on the other risk management tools that you're using. So if, for example, you're doing some level of real-time screening, then I don't think that you need to be doing this very often. But customers tend to do this on a monthly or quarterly basis. And if you notice, what we're talking about is that we're talking about protection at various levels, not just one form of protection. So ad hoc, meaning that you screen someone at various points. It could be when you're onboarding a customer as well that you're doing that. And we'll talk about onboarding the customers and how you can automate that again. We'll talk about that later. But that's another option that you should be looking at. Then there's real time, and we start off by answering why. Why is it important? Well, because in a number of situations, you might be a bank that you're sending wire transfers. You have a corresponding bank involved in another jurisdiction in another country, and the fact is that if you are not screening your transactions before those transactions go across that border and hit the other financial institution, then you're going to have a big problem in that relationship. And so what we do, or what you should be doing in terms of real-time screening, is that for certain high-risk type transactions like wire transfers, you really should be having a system that is looking at those transactions in real time, telling you, am I sending it to someone that is a high-risk individual, or has something changed in terms of it could be the description in the transfer or in the text. You have to be able to take out information in the text and look at it. You have to be able to look at the countries that it's going to, the final destination. Is there a certain high-risk destination that you would like to look at more carefully before you actually send those transfers? And so the systems should be embedded in such a way that you're always stopping those transactions before they actually go through and doing it in real time. Okay. The next thing is, so everyone is going to ask, so yeah, if I do that and I'm getting a lot of hits, how do we manage false positives? I think that there are a couple of things. One is that the more information that you can pass into your screening algorithms, the better. So some customers are using this and you're just looking at names. Don't do that. Look, get as much information as you can get into the matching process. So the names, the country that the person is in, their date of birth or their age, those things will help you to narrow down the false positives so that you're not just finding Michael Lee in 30 different countries, but if you can narrow it down to just say Canada, then you might have a much better chance of getting a proper hit and not as many false positives. Another thing too is that not all the sanctions lists might be relevant for what you're doing. If you're a business and you're really just operating within a local jurisdiction, you're not really going across borders, then you might want to narrow it down a little bit in terms of what sanctions list you're searching against. And you might choose to do that a broader search against all lists periodically, maybe every 6 months you might be wanting to do that. But in terms of really kind of narrowing it down and not getting too many false positives, that's another option. And another thing too is that when you're doing the screening, you also want to be able to use native character sets. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And another thing too is, you want to make sure that in terms of managing false positives, that your system is learning from how you are treating the exceptions as they come up or the alerts as they come up. How are you treating that and learning from that? So in terms of native character sets, this is in Arabic here, and your system should be able to ingest or take inputs in various language and native character sets and actually do the searches using that. Because if that's not the case, you're really going to have a situation where you're going to get lots of false positives. You're going to get some hits that doesn't make a lot of sense. So whatever systems you're using, this is one of the things that you should be considering. Can I actually input native character sets and get the matching algorithm to give me a good match? So one of the things that that Chris talked about too was machine learning. And machine learning can be applied two different ways here. One way is, let's say I screen a customer, I get a potential hit for that customer. When it is going to a user and that user has taken an action, they might say, hey, block the transaction, or they might say, no, go ahead and release that transaction. Or they might say, this is a false positive. All those actions that the user is taking can actually be pushed back into a machine learning type model. And that will improve and refine the type of matches and hits that you get in the future. And it also can be used to narrow down and teach the case management system how to treat it. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I got a hit on a particular customer for a wire transfer. It's this customer sending to this country, this type of amount. And then I look at that and I say, no, I researched it the first time, I blocked it. And then I see another transaction exactly like that coming back in. Why should I have to do all the due diligence again? You could actually use machine learning to say, hey, this is how I'm going to treat it. I'm going to treat it just the way that I treated it before, because as far as we are concerned, the transaction is very similar, almost the same. The kind of investigation that I've done would be identical. So why should I ask the compliance persons to do this research over and over again each time? So you're not going to get a lot of efficiencies that way. How can you just make the system make that determination? Of course, you can always revise it and or undo certain things and let that transaction go through if circumstances change. But you should be able to have the system just make those determinations, right? So that's one of the things that you should be looking at in terms of machine learning, in terms of your case management. And this is just another screen here where we're saying as the transaction is flowing through the system and it's being captured by your screening software, it actually engages someone and they do the investigation. When they're finished with the investigation, they can actually decide, hey, I want to update the model that's being used here, either the matching algorithm model or the machine learning model. How do I want to update all of that, and how do I want it to impact the system going forward? So if you have if you have a sufficient access rights, you're able to kind of tell the system, hey, use the actions that I've taken recently and update what we're doing in the future. So the next thing I'm going to go through is talk about different industries, because I know that we have persons on the call and they're from several industries, and so I kind of want to just talk about some examples in terms of what you should be doing. Everyone here that's involved in banking, I think you kind of know some of this stuff, but you should be screening persons when you're onboarding them. And if it is that your onboarding system does not have that already integrated, consider interfacing it with some sort of a screening software. So there's software out there that when you're onboarding the customer, when you type in Andrew Simpson, this address in Canada with this ID or whatever, it's able to go and call a screening software and say, hey, screen this person and tell me what's going on. And then it's able to come back and say, hey, I'm getting a hit or I'm not getting a hit for this person, you're okay. And that helps you with your onboarding process. Now, in addition to that, you should be doing periodic screening as well, which we talked about before. And some of the things that you may want to do is that you might want to do some segmentation on that. So, for example, if you find that there are certain customer segments that tends to be of a certain higher risk, or the nature of their activity or the nature of their transactions shows that they're traditionally a higher risk, you might want to be doing that more frequently. And we talked about making sure that you're doing real time for cross-border transactions. There's a number of financial institutions that I've seen where they're not really doing that, and they're running into a lot of problems in terms of their relationships. For money services businesses, there's in particularly North America, there's some debate about this in terms of, you know, whether they should or shouldn't be doing it. And I think what we have seen is where customers have decided that, hey, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're actually going to look at the customers that might be that carries a higher risk than everyone else. Based on the nature of alerts that we normally get from them. So if customers are involved in any kind of structuring activity, any kind of smurfing or flipping within your MSB infrastructure, or, you know, one of the things that Chris talked about was using network analysis to determine whether or not there are persons or individuals or group of people that they have created their own network within your own remittance network. And that is a real situation. And if that is the case, then you need to look at those persons and all the branches in the network, and those persons, I think you should be screening them just to understand the full extent of your risk or your exposure. And that is something that you can look at doing. And in terms of the country risk as well is something that you can do in terms of narrowing the focus. But MSBs are becoming more and more regulated, so keep an eye on this. Don't wait until the regulations really start getting on top of you, and then you're just scampering and running around. You don't want to be doing that. You want to be proactive. So FinTech is an interesting area because it's a refreshing and to see these companies and the things that they're doing. And a lot of people say, oh, they're going to be that Uber moment in the financial sector. And I think you're starting to see a lot of these companies mature, and the regulators are starting to pay attention, by the way. So in the past, you know, it's all just innovation. We're going to get things to work. We're going to get customers happy. We're going to be disruptive in the financial sector. But then, you know, the regulators are starting to say, hey, hold on, there's an issue here. And so in the whole FinTech space, I mean, if you want to make remittances, there's a remittance, it's a whole bunch of remittance APIs. If you want to do bill payments, it's the same thing. You know, there's the Bitcoin stuff. There are these different payment gateways, and so one of the things that I think that all the guys that are or the companies that are involved in the whole FinTech space is that you really need to be making sure that you are doing the necessary risk management and making sure that you're not vulnerable to certain type of exposure when it comes to the regulators, because the regulators are watching and they're keeping a closer eye. So you need to be proactive. And one of the things that you could do is that just look at a company that provides a similar type of infrastructure like yours. You're an API, anybody can connect to you and use it. There are companies that provide that kind of a sanction screening API that you can connect and use the same way. So you can extend yourself that way, and then you can manage your risks a lot better. So that's something that you should be looking at. On the gaming side, you know, I always think that on the gaming side you really should be doing that screening when you're onboarding a new patron, and then of course periodically doing the same thing. You can do some risk profiling to narrow the focus. So in terms of if you have persons that are involved in type of suspicious behavior activity, or the value or the volume of transaction is such that it could be a concern, then you might want to be screening those people as well. But one of the things that you want to consider too is that if it is that you have a situation where patrons are able to like move monies from their bank account into their gaming account and vice versa, I would suggest that you may want to be doing that in real time. And whether or not you have patrons that are kind of structuring those transactions and creating an exposure for you. So that's something else that you should be looking at. On the supply chain side, this is something that is starting to emerge a lot as large manufacturing and retail companies are starting to be very concerned about who they're doing business with, who are their suppliers, and whether or not they're being exposed. And there are other regulations that come into play for this as well. So if it's FCPA, meaning Foreign Corruption Practices Act, whether or not that is applicable, or any kind of anti-bribery type regulations, you need to be aware of that. So one of the things that I would suggest that you do is that when you look at your suppliers, you start to segment your suppliers in terms of their risk profile. And risk profile can vary depending on what factors you want to use. You could use like location, what items they're supplying to you, you know, your dependency on that supplier, and also the volume of business that you're doing with them. If you're doing that, and let's say you have 30,000 suppliers, that might narrow it down to like 2,000 or 3,000. And I would suggest that you screen those as well. You could also screen suppliers when you're onboarding them, right? And then you want to just be doing periodic as it changes. Now, in some situations, persons might argue that you might want to do real time. I think that maybe you want to cover the bases in the other areas first, unless it is that you're actually having some payments going out, then that is a different thing. And so in most instances, companies are doing some level of transaction monitoring around the supply chain. So what you want to do is that you want to correlate your screening results with that as well. So the last thing I want to talk about is how you enroll everyone in this. You cannot be thinking that from a compliance standpoint that this is just the responsibility of your compliance department. It cannot be. It has to be that you have to engage the entire organization. So let's say you had a situation where you get a hit on a particular customer. In most instances, the compliance department is not going to be able to look at it and assess what is really going on. It has to go back to the relationship manager. And so you need software that would do that, bring it to the relationship manager and say, hey, I need you to fill out this profile. Let me understand what is really going on. And when that person is done, then it goes back to the compliance department for them to finish that investigation. So you want to be engaging the entire organization. Another thing with this too is that when the entire organization sees that it's visibly being monitored and screened, that also changes the behavior in the field. And that reduces the number of non-compliant activity that you will see happening in the business.